I'd like to tell you a story about, I've already told you about Roberts and how we moved to Dayton. The reason we moved to Dayton was to be on, that Dad could manage this big welfare farm. And it's the one that you can see. It's part of the background. You can see the house a little better now than you have on some of the others. The closest building to the house is the chicken coop. The one closest to it is the cellar, which we helped build. The one nearest to it is the big barn, which there are several stories, including that barn. And then just behind the barn is a loafing shed. And you can see the littler roof there, which is the feeding, is the manger. There's mangers all the way around it, and the cows would go there and eat hay, and Dave and I would knock bales down out of the haystack, which was inside of the barn, and feed the hay out there. And then behind that loafing shed is where the pea silage. Let's see, did we use pea silage there or corn silage? I can't remember. Anyway, it was a silage pit. Then right where my hat is in the way is where the hay was stored. It looks like they're getting pretty close to out of hay at that moment of time. Then behind that is the corrals where you can see, and also around the loafing shed. Well, the corral for the by the loafing shed and the barn is the dairy corral, and the big corrals that you can see out there is the 200 beef that we had. Doesn't look like we had 200 then, but that's how many they maintained. We were happy to be able to come to this church farm. In my father's mind, he thought, what better in the world to do than to work for the church? That has to be the best thing you could do. And we made it there and got settled and began to work. Now, let me list to you the responsibilities that my father had. He had, as you can see out there, 200 head of beef cattle that he had to make sure were safe, fed, and doctored and taken care of at all times. And then he had 30 to 35 head of dairy cows, and the side of that barn that you can see with all the windows, that's where the dairy cows went, and they all knew their turn. They would go in there about 20 at a time, so it was only like 1.5 strings of cows that would go in there. They knew exactly which stanchion was theirs, and they would go in there and go take their, stick their head in their stanchion and begin to eat the wonderful grain and pea silage. No, they called it syrup. Anyway, we put syrup on it. Oh, they'd lap that up like it was pancakes and syrup, probably just about the same thing. Anyway, that's where that all took place. So we had the beef project, the dairy project, and then we had between 400 and 500 acres of land that had to be plowed and harrowed and planted, and once it was up, it had to be cultivated and it had to be watered. Now, watering was something else for a farm that size. We had 4 ditches that came into ours. One of them from a lake south, and one of them from a lake north, and one of them from anyway, they came from different sources. And sometimes Dad would have a turn from each one of those at the same time. That was tough. He had one hired man who was there 8 hours a day, and that was handy and that was good. But what that meant was that I, being 9 and Dave 8, when we moved there, we were put to work. And we drove tractors all the time. We pitched manure, we pitched hay, we We hauled hay, we baled hay, we did all kinds of things like that. We went to work, and of course there was no pay to that. We didn't even expect pay. We just figured that we were the kids on the farm and that we were supposed to work, and so we did. Now I don't know if you know anything about farms, but 35 head of cows in a dairy is a full-time job. 200 beef may not be a full-time job, but it's at least going on a half a time job. It's always a cow sick, always something going on that you have to take care of. The farm itself, with all the tractors needing to be kept going and all the little breaks and things that happen to equipment whenever you work with it. You cannot run a farm that size. That's a full-time job, and just running it. And then irrigating it in those days where they just had the ditches that showed up there. And you could have your turns could come at midnight or 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the night. And I remember several times seeing my dad throw a mattress on the back of the truck and drive out there to irrigate. That in itself was a full-time job. I'm not kidding when I say that. You ever want to know what was thought about that, ask Uncle Richard, who was a farmer and was very successful. He just can't believe what our dad was asked to do. Now, when we were kids, we didn't know. I mean, but he was just going all the time. I don't know why he didn't just curl up and die, but he didn't. And things didn't quite go. Yes, there were people that came out on the farm and did some work, like hoeing and, weeding and thinning and stuff like that. Yes, that happened every now and then. But there was no tractors coming from other farmers as there was later and I'll tell you about that. So it was a real bad experience. Well, after we'd been there about 5 years, evidently the High Council and the state presidency was a little concerned about the farm and whether it was making it or not. I don't know much about that because I wasn't involved with that. But one day, my dad was invited to come to a High Council meeting. Now, that happened once in a while in their planning. So it wasn't anything new. He wasn't stressed about that at all. And he went to the High Council meeting, and we went in the house and played games and bickered and laughed and poked fun of each other and all the things that kids do when there's 10 of you and not a whole lot of range to run in. All of a sudden, my dad came home, and he was very early. And he walked in through the kitchen into the living room and to the left into his bedroom and shut the door. And of course, that really piqued my interest. I just couldn't imagine. That just wasn't Dad to do that. He usually stopped and said hi and take his hat off. And well, of course, he wouldn't have had his hat on. He'd just been to a meeting. But anyway, he would mingle with us a little bit. And then if he had something to do in the bedroom, then he'd go in there, but he just walked through really fast. Mom walked in right after him because she could see something was wrong. And I went in. I was at that time, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I was about going on 14 years old. And I went over and I didn't dare walk in. I just stood by the door and listened. As far as I can remember, I was the only one there of the family other than my mother and who was in there with him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, though I could hear them talking. And then I listened very closely, and this is always hard for me to get through because never before in my life had I ever heard my big 6 foot, 215-pound father cry. But as I listened there at the door, I could hear him crying. And I could hear some of the words, and he couldn't understand why it was like that. Well, that infuriated this 14-year-old. I mean, I was just ready to rip somebody's head off. And I, like the rest of our family, we went up to bed. And the next morning I was up early. And I went out to that barn where I usually, in the back there, you can see the little corral in the back. There were some calves there, and there was some more down in this chicken coop. We didn't have any chickens in there. And our job was to feed the calves and the cows every morning and every night. So we had to do it early so we could catch the bus. I went out there, and my dad was milking like as if nothing ever happened. He just was going about work just as he ordinarily would. While he was there in that meeting, without any words of comfort or counsel or anything, he just fired my dad right in front of the whole high council. Now that frosted my biscuits and my liver and spleen. And when I got out there, I walked in there to the dairy, walked up behind all the cows, which is a very dangerous thing to do. Don't do that. And I saw my dad milking one of the cows, and I walked up to him and to where he was and said something very disparaging about the stake president. And he jumped to his feet and came over and put his big old beefsteak sized hands on my shoulders. And he said, "Abe, if I can support and sustain this stake president, you certainly should be able to." And I just was I was really, really totally taken aback by that. The fact that my dad was on the stake president's side and the stake president did what he did. It was just wrong. I knew it was wrong from the bottom of my feet to the top of my head. And all I was doing is trying to comfort my dad. And he came back and said, "If I can sustain this man, so can you." And a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to, as you did, to raise my hand at the square and say, and sustain this man as stake president. He says, "Nothing's changed. I will still do everything I can to sustain this man." Well, needless to say, Dad had to find some other way to make a living. And he had to do it fast because it was spring and he was a farmer. He made a few calls to people that he knew, and he found a loving bishop back in Roberts, Idaho, who had a big farm, who wanted to hire him. He knew him really well, knew that he was a hard-working guy, and knew that he would be really well worthwhile for my dad to hire. So we packed up, much the way we did when we came. I'm supposed to take my glasses off, I think. Somebody said that. And headed for Roberts, Idaho again. Well, as kids, you get over things pretty fast. So we went to Roberts, and of course, I already knew the kids there. It had only been 5 years. They'd all grown up a lot. And now I was a freshman in high school. And I'd grown quite a bit. And I saw my good friends and got associated with them again. And they were the Albertson boys. They were cousins, Wesley and Lyle was his older brother, but Wesley and his cousin, Billy Albertson, were my friends when I was there before and picked up right on cue. And we had some good times. I can tell you that there's a difference in places you live. The much rougher in Roberts than they were in Dayton. Dayton was a great place to grow up. It really was. The kids seemed to have been taught about the Savior and about the gospel much more than the kids in Roberts were. And I don't say that disparagingly about Roberts, because there are some really good people there. But that was just my experience. And we were there for a year. And then my brother-in-law, Darrell Lewis, married to Jerry, was a bishop in Salt Lake City. And they were going to have a welfare farm in Highland, Utah. And they asked Dad if he would like to do it. Now, they knew what happened to Dad. Evidently, they didn't believe it either. I don't know. But anyway, Dad went for an interview and he got the job, and away we went down the road again, this time 8 hours away. We drove to Highland, Utah. Oh my, I wish I had a picture of that one, but it doesn't exist anymore. That was a beautiful place. The house was not particularly beautiful, but it was really a nice, well-built brick home. And the farmyard was set up and so nice. There were buildings on both sides of a road that went straight down behind the house. And it was well organized, and it was a wonderful farm. Dad managed that farm for 5 years also. It's funny, it was 5 years. After 4 years, let's see, I moved there when I was 15. So after 4 years, I went on a mission. I was one of the first 19-year-old missionaries to go out. And I went out and went to New England. So when I was in the mission field, I got the word that they were moving back to Dayton. And for all the credit that I can give those brethren, I tell you, they really had a little fight between the church farm in Highland and the church farm in Dayton to get my father to come to work for them. My father and mother thought about it for some time, and realizing that the farm in Dayton was in farm country and that it would probably be a little better. They liked Dayton. That was their hometown. And so they chose to go back to Dayton. And these people were so cordial and apologetic to my parents. I just have to really hand it to them, because where else would you find anybody that would even do that, let alone be so cordial in their affections. By then, there was a new stake president, and the new stake president was a man that I had always respected. He had a daughter my age, and he was a great guy. There was just no question about it. And he took my dad and mom into his office, or at least to a private place. I don't know where for sure. And apologized and said, "We want to make things right for you." So guess what? He went to the farm and found out that they had closed down the dairy. They still had the 200 cows. They didn't irrigate anymore. They had sprinkler systems and everything was piped. And all he had to do is start the sprinkler system and walk away, and it would sprinkle all day long. What a wonderful change. And not only that, but when it was time to plow a field, about 6 tractors would show up from somewhere, some ward in the stake that was assigned to, and they would have it done in a fraction of the time we used to do it. When it was hay baling time, all the people would come out and bale and haul the hay. We still stayed plenty busy. I shouldn't say we, because by then I was gone. I was on my mission and then later married within 3 months of my getting home. But Richard and Dave was the same. He was gone too. But Richard and John were busy on that farm as well. The only thing is they got paid. They wanted to do everything right. And boy, they did. My dad was there another 12 years before he retired. And then he came into American Fork, Utah after he retired, and went into the insurance business with me. And we had a wonderful time there together. I've never seen a better Cinderella story in my whole life. It was great. And you know what? Everybody makes mistakes. Even the church makes mistakes. The Lord wants them to make mistakes so that they can progress and learn and grow. This stake had never had a stake farm before, and they made mistakes, and they progressed and they grew. And when they finally got to where they needed to be, it was a beautiful, wonderful farm. And I just hope that if I can get any word across to you, anyone who listens to this, just understand that people, whether they're stake or general authorities, leaders, they are people. We have no vertical climb in the church. The apostles don't have any greater opportunity to go to the celestial kingdom than you do. All you have to do is just keep the commandments and serve the Lord, love him, and raise your kids. Do all the things that make you happy anyway. And you will be in the celestial kingdom with many of those people, those great people that were apostles and prophets and bishops and stake presidents and area presidents and so on and so forth. The Lord matches you to the aptitude that you have. And that's the important thing. A Sunday school teacher, a good Sunday school teacher, is just as good as a good apostle or a good 70. So please keep that in mind. In the church, everybody's on the same level, and that level is the love that the Lord feels for them. And he teaches us, I should say, and we have the opportunity to be celestial and to be with our families and our friends. What a wonderful, wonderful opportunity that is.